It's Wednesday, the middle of the week, hump day, 2 days till payday, or all downhill from here. And that got me thinking about back in high school, well, when I was in high school, and in literature class, we would talk about the plot diagram. And I don't know what they teach now, but basically the plot diagram was this 5-step thing. It was basically, it went up and then it went down. So it started at the beginning of the story, and that was the exposition, and then there was the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then the resolution, or in some textbooks it was called the denouement, denouement, and pronounced in English anyway. But yeah, D something. And so I don't know what got me thinking about these two things at the same time. I guess maybe because there's 5 days in the week, because the weekend is kind of like off on its own. But either way, I was thinking about climaxes in stories, and so that's what I'm going to talk about real briefly. Now, when we were in school and they had that whole plot diagram thing, and then when we would take tests about stories that we read, one of the questions on the test would always be, what was the climax of the story? And I think it had to have been maybe Romeo and Juliet. And so the climax was considered, for educational purposes, to be right after Romeo killed Tybalt for killing Mercutio or whatever, and then Romeo had to secretly marry Juliet, and then they were going to run away and be together. And so the reason that that was the answer was because everything was going good for Romeo up until that point. He had met this girl, they'd fallen in love, everything was going all right up until that point where he had to run away. So it was kind of all downhill from there. And a lot of the stories that we read in high school, the test had that question, and the answer was always something in the middle of the excerpt or the passage or whatever. But when I think about that now, wouldn't the climax be right when they killed themselves, sort of toward the end? I mean, that was the kind of point of no return, kind of the height of the drama and tension, because it's just like, oh no, ugh. So, I don't know, the whole thing just got me wondering and pondering about where the climax should go. Because you, I've read a couple of stories that people have sent me, and there there's always some sort of big plot twist that happens roughly right in the middle of the book. And in one, like everything had happened and built up, and then right in the middle of the book, something crazy happened, and then everything after that, immediately after that, takes place like 1 year later, and it's kind of the aftermath of that thing that happened, and it was eventually they worked out what had happened, and then they paid for it. But the climax was still right in the middle. And when you think about the days of the week, there's 7. So you've got Monday to Sunday, and Wednesday is kind of considered the climax of the week, because if you work a Monday to Friday or go to school, that means, okay, now you're more than halfway done. You only have 2 days left. And so that's kind of how we look at it. But if we were to write everything that we did in a week down in a book, and say we did 25 pages for each day. So that means that a book about our week would be roughly 175 pages long, and then your climax would take place on a Wednesday around between pages 50 and 75. And that doesn't seem right, especially because like Tuesday and Wednesday are the most boring days of the week. The climax is really Friday, because on Friday that's when the most stuff happens to you, because you still had to go to work and do whatever, but then you usually will do, they're like, okay, you can party, you can stay up late, you can do whatever you want because you don't have to go to work on Saturday, or you don't have to go to school tomorrow. So a lot more happens on Friday, and almost just as much happens on Saturday, and even kind of on Sunday too. But then of course you have to dial it down and go to sleep at some point because you have to go back to your regular life on Monday. So if you were to be writing a book about your week, the most interesting point would be on Friday, on between pages 100 and 125, closer toward the end of the book, in the third section. And so I did some research about the climax, and it turns out that the one that we learned in school is just a really old method from a guy who liked tragic stories. And so that's why he did it like that, because basically the stories that he liked featured where things would get better and better and better for the person, and then it would be a tragedy. So then all of a sudden things would turn with the plot twist, and then eventually he'd lose it all by the end. So unless you're writing a tragedy, you don't necessarily have to follow that same arc. And another thing that I've come to realize when I write is that you don't have to have just one climax either, especially because nowadays we write stories that tend to have like a main plot and then a secondary plot, and then sometimes even an internal kind of character. Like usually there's more than one plot, usually there can be two or three, and so every plot that you do has to have some kind of climax and some kind of resolution to it. So you can't really accomplish that with just one climax. And even like every Harry Potter book, I doubt that the climax would be considered the middle of the school year. It's usually right in the middle of whatever battle he's going to do with whatever flunky that Voldemort sends after him that year. But then, of course, after the climax and after he defeats whoever, there's kind of a couple of more chapters where they kind of talk about what happens after the fact. So the climax doesn't have to be at the very end, but it's kind of something that, at least for the overall book, should kind of be, I guess, in the middle of the third act. But then you can have other climatic events take place in the middle, at the midpoint, and even in the first act if you want to. That's something that I did in one of the books where I wrote, where there were somewhat three climaxes, where one took place in the first third and one took place in the middle, and then the other one in the final battle. So I don't know, if you use the old plot diagrams that we learned in school to write your stories, it's just somewhat a dated concept. I mean, you can do it that way. It's nothing wrong with doing it that way, but just don't feel confined to have your climax be dead in the center of your book if that's not where it belongs. And you also don't have to limit yourself to just one. So to wrap this all up, the climax is basically a turning point, sort of. It's the point in the story that has the most drama or the highest amount of tension or action, depending on what you're writing. And you don't have to limit that to the dead center of your book, because that would be the midpoint. So it's kind of like in math when they had us doing that whole the midpoint, not the midpoint, the mean, the median, and the mode. Usually the mean, median, and mode were kind of near each other, but they didn't always have to be, which is why they were three different things. So your climax and your midpoint don't have to be the same, even though that's sort of kind of what people at my age were taught. So just, do what comes naturally to you and your story, and just make sure that when you build up to that climatic moment, that it doesn't just kind of come out of nowhere. So work your way up to it, and then after you have a climax, you kind of want to work downward from it to sort of give the audience time to cool off. So basically, if you do too many climatic things one after the other, and you just more and more and more and more and more, that can burn people out. So you definitely want to have rising action and you want to have falling action. And then even if you rise again, you still want to fall again. So when you get to the end of your story, you want to be coming down from something. You don't want to just be going up, 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 and it's over. Okay? Alright, so this one's going to be a short one today. I was just kind of thinking about it, and so I decided to do a short video about it. Hopefully, when you are planning your story out, if you're one of those types, and so you're trying to figure out how to do your events, you don't have to put your most exciting moment in the middle of the story. So feel free to let your story flow naturally and put things where you want them. Alright? That's all I have to say about that. Hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see you sooner rather than later.